All right, so we are on day 3, if you were here for the workshop. So, it's also Saturday here. I'm still a little messed up from the time zone difference, but, that's fine too. It's 3 a.m. at home, and that's a little crazy. But, I want to thank you all for coming and, troopering through, especially on the weekend for those that are local, and, certainly for the ones that are out of town. You're probably a little jet lagged like me. But in this session, we're going to talk about something that's really cool, at least in my opinion, and that's code that creates code. So basically, we're going to be talking about taking a REST API specification and turning that into commandlets. And then because of how fast and really how much has changed, since just the point of me submitting this session, we're going to talk about a couple of the different ways that some companies are doing this, namely VMware, which is who I work for, as well as Microsoft. So I'm going to cover the conference stuff first. Fill out your surveys. That's how they determine what sessions are good for the audience. So please do those. I don't think we have to worry about the social events anymore. And definitely reach out to the speakers like myself and some of the other folks, including the people from the Microsoft team. Have those conversations. This is really unique access, and personally, I really enjoy it. And I love Twitter. Big advocate of Twitter. Use the hashtags. Tweet PSConfAsia. So a little about the agenda here that we're talking about. First, I'm going to start with a little bit of an overview on the VMware API history. Because it's kind of important to cover that, to see really where we're trying to go, and really where everyone's trying to go in this new code creating code by Swagger. Going over a little bit of the REST API standard, what that means, how it's defined, tooling that you can use with it to create some of your documentation, other things like that. And then we're going to dive right into the tooling that you can use to generate commandlets themselves. So a little bit about me. My name is Kyle Ruddy. I'm a senior technical marketing architect for VMware. I cover vSphere and VMware Cloud on AWS. And in those particular areas, I cover all things that are automation. So APIs, CLIs, SDKs. Outside of that, though, I do a whole lot of stuff for the community, including speaking at events like these and VMware user groups and other conferences. But anything that I create, I share. So it's either out there on my blog or on GitHub. Yeah. Oh. Do you have more than one shirt? I do not have more than one shirt. We had a lot of shirts. That was a giveaway at VMworld 2016, I think, where basically if you created a pull request against the PowerCLI community repo, we gave you a shirt. I'm sure we could make a special run, in certain. Oh, no, yeah, I do have more than just this. Well, I mean, that's what laundry's for, and there are hotel services for that. Again, I'm a big advocate of Twitter. KM Ruddy is my account that's out there. And recently, as of August, I was designated a Microsoft MVP in the cloud and data center management area. So that was. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very exciting. So a little bit about the API history to kind of show you what we're working with when we're going through and talking about generating these commandlets. So for the most part, we've been known as a SOAP API for vSphere. I should also say that for most of this, I'm talking about vSphere. It's SOAP-based, so you're using XML. It's very well-defined, almost a little too much, especially for somebody like myself who has more of an ops background than a development type background. So getting through, how finely grained it is a little nuts. And I'll give an example of how that is here in just a second. But for the APIs themselves, we have our managed objects. Those are those top-level items. If you're familiar with the PowerShell verb noun context, you'll recognize a lot of these managed objects are going to be those nouns. So like VM, data center, data store, things of that nature. Each of those have properties, descriptors essentially, name, IP address, power state, how much disk space, stuff like that. And then each one of those managed objects, I should say, has methods. Those methods are actions. In the PowerShell world, that's what's known as your verbs. Over the years, we've kind of graduated through and really elevated our game as far as the APIs that are accessible and public. So, if you go back to the 2.0 days, we had 51 managed objects. Kind of small. As of 6.0, which was even 2 releases ago, we're up to 122. Properties have gone up a little bit, but the methods are the piece that's really exploded. Going from 250 to over 800. So if you think about that in the context of a commandlet, we're talking like that's 830 some commandlets. If we were to directly translate from the API into PowerShell or PowerCLI in this case. So that's kind of a big ordeal. That's a lot of manpower. That's a lot of people that are using that time to create these commandlets. So here's an example. What happens if you were to just use the SOAP API? Just go through and do it in .NET. We're literally talking 227 lines of code because of how the API is configured. It's that finely grained. So we're talking you have to specify every single adapter. You have to tell it that we want this SCSI device to be this particular type. We want, we're going to have to define every single hard disk. How many CPUs are there? Hot add, not hot add, so on and so forth. And really kind of the cool thing about the power of PowerShell and PowerCLI that I kind of like to show off, even when I'm not at PowerShell events, is we can condense this 227 lines into a one-liner essentially. It's kind of nasty because I wanted to show it side by side, so I didn't use splatting, but minor details. So as of vSphere 6.5, we made a huge change, and we released what's known as a REST-based API. So as part of that, that allowed us to do a lot of changes. So we had a lot of technical debt, as it were, with some of the SOAP APIs. So this allowed us to fix that. This also allowed us to introduce some engineering time and dedication to really correcting the problem of how we get from point A to point B as far as our documentation, our SDKs, PowerCLI, and a couple other items too. So we made a huge change. We're rewriting the entire API. It's a long process, but it's all in the name of simplification, ease of use, and so forth. So let's start talking some standards and some of the tooling. So we kind of went over like 830 commandlets. That's kind of a big deal if we did that on a one-to-one basis. So now that we've moved off to REST API, let's talk about what it's using on the back end. So we're using what's known as currently an OpenAPI specification. Now, if you're not familiar with that and you're more familiar with the Swagger specification, that's what it was for versions 1.0 and 2.0. With version 3, they've moved it, and now they're calling it the OpenAPI specification. This is something new that I learned as just part of this process, because for the most part, a lot of people or a lot of APIs that you're going to be interacting with out there are going to be on version 2. Version 3 is still pretty new. A couple of the notable parts. This was founded in 2010 by Reverb. Already covered the Swagger specification, but basically what the spec is doing, it allows you to describe what the API is in and of itself. So here's kind of an example. Stole this from the Star Wars API, which is a really cool API if you've never really interacted with an API before, and you're a Star Wars fan. Kind of helps you learn. But we just start off with some of the metadata, Swagger 2.0. Where's this coming from? What's the host name? Paths. Do we support HTTPS and HTTP or one or the other? And then we start to get into the actual methods themselves. So we're doing right there a get against the allegiances, and then we can see what kind of things that we're going to start getting back, including a description and the ID, as well as responses. And so you know what a 200 is if you've ever used a web page. Same thing for REST APIs. Now, so what happened to Swagger? So Swagger has kind of changed, kind of pivoted a little bit, and so now they are a tool set, essentially. So they have some open source stuff, namely the Swagger editor, which allows you to take that specification, or rather create a specification and display it in a UI, which is what's known as the Swagger UI. And I'll show a little bit of that here in a second. But more notably, this thing called Swagger Code Gen, which allows you to create client-facing SDKs. So this, again, this is something that Swagger's doing. It's included, it's open sourced, it's already out there and available. However, the languages are fairly limited, especially when it comes to terms like folks like us who are PowerShell users, because PowerShell is not one of those languages. They also have some professional stuff that's out there. So if you hear the word Swagger Hub, it's basically taking all those open source tools, making them available with third-party features, integrations, support, stuff like that. And then there's the Swagger Inspector, which is just a testing and documentation API, kind of taking that to the next level. So let's kind of take a look at what Swagger is, because it's kind of cool to not only see that in action, but also to understand what you're going to be interacting with once you get to the point of trying to create your own commandlets. And I'm going to need to switch this to the other screen. There we go. So here's the Swagger editor. Up here, by default, it comes loaded with the pet store, which, if you've ever reached out to swagger.io, this is the default one that they show and have you interact with, start messing around with. So on the left-hand side, that's the specification itself. On the right-hand side, that's the UI that it's generated for us, for that Swagger UI. We can kind of play with this a little bit too. Let's show the YAML here that I'll be messing with in a second to create some stuff. So here I put in the XKCD YAML file. Interacts with XKCD, so pulls back some funny comics. However, this is one of the other things that I've found. The more and more that I've gone through the learning process is that not all OpenAPI specifications or Swagger specs are created equal. So that's been a very enlightening moment. So like over here off to the right-hand side, we can see that there's an error, but we can see that it found essentially two methods there. Let's take a look at another one that, where did my cursor go back? Here's another one for the times. But it basically, gives you some information, matches up with the description that's there, shows you your methods, shows you some information about each of these methods. But once you have the Swagger UI, you can also modify it. You can customize it. You can make it your own. So what I've got here is the API Explorer that's set up against a vCenter server. So we've got, we've customized the top over there to include the VM logo. This is looking at one of a couple different services that we have. We can go through and show each one of those sections. Gets to the point of being able to customize your parameters. And then towards the bottom, you can use this try it out button. So that's kind of cool. And then one other thing that I want to show, because you can kind of skill up the whole Swagger UI, unless this is going to kick me out. There we go. So here's a API Explorer that's in our VMware Cloud on AWS service. So here at this point, we can also now start filling in some of these parameters. We can make changes to them. You can do some really cool stuff. So like here's an SDDC ID that's not filled in. We have a drop-down box of an SDDC that I created earlier called PSConf Asia. If I scroll back down, it fills it in. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with Swagger. It's all open source. It's all really cool. So let's get back into this. All right, so let's start talking conversion tooling and start applying this more onto the PowerShell side. So auto-rest was a really big thing, or rather I should say is a really big thing, because it's still under current development. This is something that Microsoft created. They open source. This really came on my radar, I believe last year, through one of the lightning demos at the PowerShell Summit US. But this is very similar to the Swagger code gen. You know, you run through your YAML or your JSON, your Swagger spec, through this tooling, and it produces all these things, or it can produce all of these languages. But again, one of the things that we're missing here is PowerShell. So also what was on display during those lightning demos last year was something called PSSwagger. So this is another open source solution project for Microsoft. Gives you, basically takes in your YAML, your JSON, spits out commandlets. Really cool. It does offer cross-platform support, so that's great. So I can use it on stuff like my Mac. It's also built in to follow those PowerShell guidelines and best practices. This was, again, something that I found really interesting as part of the lightning demos a year or so back. A couple of things that it required, though. You had to have the module. So super simple. On the PowerShell gallery, install module, PSSwagger. Had to have Node.js. That's part of the requirements for auto-rest. npm install g auto-rest. Super easy. And then CSC, the CSC executable. Now, however, this is where we get back into that whole not all Swagger specs are created equally. So if we run this on one of the vCenter specifications, which took one of the example script there, ran through, so we could see that it's looking at some of our paths for like VM, apparently storage, some VM inventories, specifically for the network. And then we get this fun error that's down here at the bottom, essentially saying that our schema validator failed. So, you know, no bueno on the output from this. But you know, you dig through the issues that's out there. Again, this is an open source project, so everything's out in the open. So, you know, much appreciated that to the Microsoft folks. But as part of this, we find out that this is really geared towards Azure Swagger specifications, essentially. So that was kind of a learning experience. And then a little while, well, here recently, as of June, somebody mentioned that, hey, by the way, you know, doesn't seem like there's too much activity going on out here. And that was confirmed pretty quickly, actually, and saying, you know, hey, the project no longer being maintained. However, there's an upcoming project being worked on. So great, very cool. You know, sit back and hang out while I do some other stuff while I was preparing this session. However, I really didn't have to wait all that long because within, it was like the next day, I think, Garrett, better known as the Cowboy, Fear the Cowboy is his Twitter account. He tweeted this out. Now, if you see what we're talking about here, it's auto-rest in a PowerShell generator. And more notably, a technical fellow happened to comment on it, and it's one that we kind of all know and love. So that was really cool to see. So it's really cool to see that kind of impact, especially internally to Microsoft and how engaged they are. So with that, let me talk about AutoRest, the PowerShell generator, because again, this is something that's really extremely new. It came out in between the time that I submitted the session and today, so I've had a little bit of time to play with it. But this is, again, another open source project, very much like PSSwagger. It offers multi-platform support. Again, it requires Node.js and AutoRest. So AutoRest is very much still being worked on and still being used. We do have to use PowerShell core, though, to actually build the module. That is the one kind of big change that I noticed in between the two versions, but really not a big deal because PowerShell core works everywhere. And then instead of using a PowerShell commandlet itself, we're making an AutoRest call to actually perform the creation. And then we follow that up with a PS1, a script, to build that module. And I've got a demo of that we'll actually run through creating those here in just a second. But here's an example of it running against that same vCenter JSON spec. So, very similar, vCenter inventory, for the network, couldn't find. Schema validator still failed, but, read the documentation, that's kind of expected. Currently, it's mainly focused on the Azure Swagger piece. So with that, there's something that the VMware's been working on because we found this very interesting and really want to kind of, take our stuff to the next level as well. So what we have is something that's known as the VAPI framework. So this is something that we've developed internally. If it will ever go open source or not, that's kind of up for debate. But this kind of goes to some crazy lengths, which is also why it may never see the light of day. But we're creating our documentation. We're creating all these SDKs. We're creating PowerCLI modules. We're creating some of the integrations for data center CLI, as well as vRealize Orchestrator, which is under the covers JavaScript. So included in our languages, we've got Python, Java, Perl, .NET, and Ruby. We've already got most of those already out there and published. However, one of the new things, and this is, again, it's something else that came out in between my submitting this session and today, is an OpenAPI generator. So this is me harping at our engineers and saying, hey, us having our own Swagger spec, it really does nobody any good outside of just us. So if we're going to release this out into the wild, like let's do better. Let's make this better. And as it's being recorded, I shouldn't say that was all me, but I was one of the voices in that crowd. And so what we have is this VMware OpenAPI generator. It was supposed to be released last week, and for reasons unbeknownst to me, it's still not public as of today. But basically, it converts it to an OpenAPI spec. So taking a little bit of look at what these two kind of look like, on the left-hand side is the OpenAPI spec that it fed out. On the right-hand side is the, for the lack of a better term, vSphere-Swagger. So, we have no kind of definition up at the top about what's happening. We have a lot of assumptions that are being made. So, that's one of the reasons that it was not working with any of these other tooling. And, if I put this through the Swagger code gen, it didn't work there either. So, this isn't a Microsoft issue. This is totally an us issue. So, we can see that it's added in some of the Swagger information up there at the top on the left-hand side. And then it's a little more detailed. Through here. So we can see here's a inventory data store method. So some of the descriptions, some of the other information, whereas on this side we're going really deep into, it's a little messy. Engineers don't like it when I show it, but minor details, it's all out there, anybody can access it. So one of the things that we've done with all of the progress that we've made on our VAPI framework is we've released our first set of commandlets that were auto-generated. So this is for NSX-T and specifically, first, yes?
So now that you generate OpenAPI, will the auto-rest stuff, would it work against that if you wanted to?
Not currently.
Still hasn't broken?
Yeah, I've got some issues to open. Yes. So we've this is our first iteration going down this path. We've got 280 different commandlets just covering the gets. So again, this is something that takes time away from our engineers being focused on creating stuff, and kind of makes this a whole lot easier for them so that we can get stuff out into the public. We were able to add in multi-platform support, so Mac OS, Linux, you're all set. However, some of the output leaves some things to be desired. So if you'll notice our first commandlet right here, nobody wants to type that. Like tab complete is awesome, but nobody wants to type in get compute collection transport node template state. I don't even like saying that.
Delna has a 49-inch screen, so you can.
I heard. There's my justification right there. No, this is how I run my commandlets. I need that much real estate. And then we had some other things like get CRL. It's very ambiguous. You have no idea. Is this for NSX-T? Is this for Active Directory? Is this for our vCenter? What's this for? So we're kind of missing some things there. And we get a little better as we go down. LB virtual server, load balancer virtual server. But if you've got other things that you're working on, if you've got an F5 module, if you've got some Azure modules, you might have those things in there as well. Logical switch, pretty straightforward. But so here's kind of a look at some of the parameters. This was the other big kind of learning experience that you kind of have to get used to with this. And when I use PowerShell, I normally rely on names. Whereas with these, because we're generating this based off of an API standard, the API is looking for IDs. So here's part of the parameter set. We have host ID. We have owner VM ID, VM ID, things like that. That really aren't, you don't want to have to do multiple calls to figure out one thing. So this is kind of the area where somebody made the comment that you can kind of smell an auto-generated commandlet. You kind of get that feeling that this was not something that somebody human actually interacted with and created and had their hands on. And then here's some of the output. So we're taking a look at a firewall section. So instead of having that normal kind of XML crafted or limited field, nice clean output, you're just getting a response of all the things. Is that good? Is it wrong? Up to you. But for the most part, I'd rather have this a little more condensed instead of this mess. All right, so let's actually take a look at auto rest running, because I thought that was really cool, and I finally got it to work the other day. Ooh, I'm going to have to switch screens again, aren't I? All right, so we're going to be using that XKCD YAML that I showed earlier. Let's kick out my terminal here. So we're going to go ahead and change my location here. Let's see, I think I have to hit Control. Go away. All right, so in there we've got our, it ran twice, lovely. So let's take a look at our YAML here again. Pretty straightforward, pretty condensed. There's not a whole lot of methods going on in here. There's only two, so we'll only get 2 commandlets out. Let's go back to our code here. Then here's our big giant auto rest line here. So we have to tell it to use the auto rest incubator. The auto rest incubator. We want to generate out PowerShell. Our input file is our YAML file that we called earlier. We're going to have a namespace of XKCD, and then we're going to kick this out to a folder called generated modules XKCD. And just to verify here, that folder is empty. So let's run this. Maybe. And this will take a couple seconds. But it's actually really fast. So we can see the version of AutoRest that we're using, version of nodes on there. Go away, messages. And just like that, it's done. So if we go back to our folder here, see that we've got our private folder, some tests, our build module script that I was referring to earlier, a couple different YAML files, a generate help. So that's another cool addition that showed up here recently. And then our module file, descriptor file. However, we're not done. So like if I try and import this directly, it's not going to work. Generated modules, XKCD. Yeah, so we have an error, not working. But that's fine because we still need to do our build. So jumping into PowerShell core.
It's worth noting that's because PowerRest actually produces a C# commandlets. And
Correct.
This is just the wrapper to
Well, it produces C# commandlet implementation. It produces actually scripts commandlet definition.
Everybody's learning in this session. All right, so now that we're in PowerShell core, we can go ahead and run our build here. Come on. No. And that'll take just a couple seconds as well. Yeah. So REST is a type of API. So it's a web standard, or rather it's not a standard, it's a definition. So much like VMware used to use, well, still uses SOAP, then there's also other APIs that are known as REST, and then there's some new ones that are coming out actually all the time. No. So this is taking the input from a REST API and creating things based upon that REST API.
Yeah, the reason it doesn't mention PowerShell is because it generates lots of stuff that's not PowerShell. It generates Go and Python.
Yep.
.NET and all kinds of things.
Yep. Correct. Correct. It's that OpenAPI or Swagger specification. All right, so there we go. We've gone through, done the build module. We get a nice little message there at the end saying, hey, you could import your module, specifies the PSD file for it, and you're all set. So let's go ahead and do that. So now if we do a get module, if I can type correctly, we can see there that now we have our XKCD module. So we have two different commands that are there as well. But let's verify here. Let's run a get command. So we can see now we have get XKCD comic or get XKC comic for today. So let's take a look at the. I'm going to use the get XKCD comic. Show you guys my favorite one. Oops. So here scrolling too fast. So here's our parameters. We can do a couple things there, but the most notable one that we'll be using is comic ID. So that one right there. Oops. So we'll do get xkcd comic ID, and we're going to specify 979. So now that it's responded back, show the output. There we go. So we can see the alt text, we can see a direct link to the image itself, titles, so on and so forth. Doing this all through a PowerShell commandlet, not using invoke web request or invoke REST method. And then we can take this a step further and say, hey, we want to see this this image itself. We can do a start process and call out the image there, the image property. Oops, Denver coder. And in a perfect world, this will pop up Chrome. Or, yeah, we're in a Microsoft Office, so Edge could be. Well, true, I did say perfect world, so. So just like that, we can pop up the actual image itself and, Denver coder 9, what did you see? So let's go back to the slides here, finish up. In conclusion, some of the lessons that I learned through this process. The resources that are surrounding this are rapidly expanding. There's just so much change that's going on. There's so many improvements that are happening. There's a lot of community involvement. So it's really excited to see that happening because I think this is going to be extremely valuable over the long run, especially as REST adoption increases and increases. So that's really excellent. Not all OpenAPI specifications are created equal. We've seen the vSphere we've heard about Azure Swagger, and then there's the OpenAPI standard itself. And then even if you use the VMware OpenAPI generator, that still didn't quite work exactly as planned. Quality is going to be really highly dependent upon the specification and the metadata that's being used. So if you have a crappy API standard or crappy API spec, you're going to have crappy PowerShell commandlets or crappy SDK utilization at the end of this thing. So if you have any involvement into that, make sure that a lot of time and effort is put into that. And auto-generated commandlets kind of have a certain feel to them. Like somebody told me earlier, they kind of have a smell. So I think some human interaction is still going to be required for a little while, just to make sure that people either understand the differences between the two, or really just to massage it to get it to the point where the code that's generating this other code can adapt and start learning some situations like where we would rather take a look at a name. So in other words, we're basically talking about using two methods to generate back the response from one commandlet. So with that, that's all I have. Thank you, and there's my Twitter handle again.